There we go. Um, so you just took away my intro question, basically. Who here was involved in a production incident or in an outage in responding to it? Excellent. You should all come up later, and I'm going to give you a high five. I've been involved in quite a few of them over the last 18 months since I joined Travis CI. And that is, yeah, basically the small company from Berlin in Germany where I hail from, where I work. We started out as a hosted continuous integration platform for open source projects, and now we're a product platform, but that's not really what I want to talk about. Over the last 18 months, as I was involved in a lot of outages, we tend to be very public about them, write long postmortems about what we found out in hindsight. And I got very fascinated with the human factors involved and how potentially other industries handle something similar like that, and how they handle failure, how they handle risk, how they handle safety, all that kind of stuff, and how they handle stressful situations. Because when you're handling an outage, that's what you're in. You're in a stressful situation. And so what I want to start talking about is failure. And when you think about failure, this is usually what you think of. It's pretty much a train wreck, quite literally. And the thing that occurred to me over the last year is that you actually don't talk about failure. What you talk about is risk and what you think about. Because what's the risk of a train actually crashing through the train station and landing out on the street? I would put forward that maybe back then it was a little bit higher risk, but by now no one even thinks this could happen. No one is really even considering that a train would come into the train station maybe with the driver falling asleep and just crashing through the wall and landing outside on the street. And risk is definitely something very interesting because it's not a fixed property of anything. If you think about risk, everyone has a different perception of it. As a parent, to me, crossing the street with my daughter, it definitely has a different risk attached to it than to some bike rider in New York City crossing every red light. There's a very different risk attached to it. And in an organization or in a company, in your team, the only way how you can actually measure risk or have a common perception of it is by actually talking about it, by talking about the risk that is involved in all kinds of weird scenarios that are going to happen to your production system, because weird things are going to happen to your production system. It's also something I had to learn the hard way over the last 18 months. And concerning risk, I want to look at a very specific incident, how that actually came about. Does anyone remember what happened on that day? That was the day of the Challenger launch, a fatal Challenger launch. It had the space shuttle designation STS-51-L, and it was the 25th space shuttle launch. And this is actually the first time the Challenger actually launched into space. That was in 1983. But what happened on that day? It was very early in Cape Canaveral. It was freezing. It was actually below zero temperature-wise. The start actually went fairly well as an outsider, but if you've been around long enough and if you remember how that entire launch went, it didn't go very well. It only took 73 seconds for a catastrophe to happen. And this is probably what most people remember how that actually went. It is not a great thing to talk about because humans actually died during that incident, but to me, it was very fascinating to look at all the risks involved in this incident actually being able to come together. And if you look at what happened here, it's actually Challenger did not explode. Challenger, one of the booster rockets that is supposed to launch Challenger into space, actually crashed into the tank and caused a lot of vapor, steam, and stuff flying about at velocities of up to 20 G, and eventually to crash into the ocean. And what happened afterwards was there was an immediately a presidential commission was formed. Like, people started investigating. Richard Feynman, who is a very famous physicist, not physician, he's a physicist, was involved in that commission. They interviewed hundreds of people. They accrued an enormous amount of paperwork. Still, the entire NASA paperwork regarding the Challenger incident is stored in 2 warehouses. And the most important takeaway that I immediately learned from that and from looking at other incidents is that there is no root cause. Whenever someone tells you that there is a root cause, and they found out what it is, they're wrong. Because what they call root cause is basically the place where you stop. Hold on, I'm going to quote this. What you call root cause is simply the place where you stop looking any further. That's what Sidney Dekker had to say about that. Sidney Dekker is a researcher and practitioner when it comes to safety, human errors, and handling stressful situations. And that pretty much hit home, because if you think about any incident, there's no single root cause that came together. And Richard Cook, who's another researcher, had the following to say about that. Overt catastrophic failure occurs when small, apparently innocuous failures join to create opportunity for systemic accident. Each of these small failures is necessary to cause catastrophe, but only the combination is sufficient to permit failure. So what he basically said is that whenever you have some accident occurring, when you have catastrophe happening, there's no such thing as one single thing causing it. You have multiple things coming together. And to actually find out which they are, you have to keep asking questions. You have to keep asking why. And this is particularly fascinating about Challenger, because when you look at it at the surface, it was a technical problem. And let's look at it in a little bit more detail. If you look up here, the orbit is basically launched into space by 2 solid booster rockets attached to a giant tank. That tank has basically all the rocket fuel in it, and the booster rockets are basically just responsible for blowing it out as fast as possible. And the solid booster rocket is a very fascinating thing, because one of the premises of the space shuttle program was to have an economic way of continuing to launch space shuttles into space. So the solid booster rockets, the same things on the side, were constructed in a way that allowed them to come apart. They're like small pieces just assembled together, and when the space shuttle launches, they're just going to be dropped into the ocean, and they can be collected later on with ships basically built for that particular purpose. And the fascinating part is how these things are actually assembled. When you have two pieces of the solid booster rocket, this is the joint where they come together. And it's a very simple construction. This is the combustion chamber. This is the joint itself. There's some sort of putty here that basically protects hot gases from coming out through this gap here. And there's two very small rings. They're called O-rings. They're basically rubber. And these 2 rubber rings are basically the responsibility is to also keep the hot gases from expanding out from the solid booster rocket. And they're simply made of rubber. It's a very simple concept. And during the first space shuttle flight, the very first one, the engineers started noticing that the gap, where the 2 O-rings are in, it started coming apart. It started opening up because the joint rotated, and that put such extreme physical force on the joint itself that a gap formed. And that it was quite curious, because when the rubber rings are constructed in a way that they seal the joint, under ideal conditions. When the gap is in its ideal width. But when the gap forms, when the things come apart, there's not really any space for the O-rings. But what they discovered, what happened was the O-rings would just drop into that gap. And it would basically accidentally seal the thing anyway. So hot gases could not get out of the joint. And they figured, if it does happen, there's always that secondary ring, because like at the top, what has the letter B assigned to it, you have the primary O-ring, and below it you have the secondary O-ring. And another thing they noticed later on was that these rubber rings don't respond very well when it's very, very cold. Now, if you know Florida, it doesn't get very cold a lot in Florida. It's not really what it's famous for. But in certain launch conditions, they found that when it was too cold, the rubber rings don't respond to that very well, and they stiffen up. So when a rubber ring stiffens up, it is not really able to move about freely. It would not, for example, not be able to fall into the gap easily to actually seal it. So that's quite fascinating. You have 2 things that the engineers knew. The engineers knew way up front about these risks. They knew about one of them from the very beginning, but over time they developed a very curious perception of it. They found out, they assumed that this joint rotation, that the risk of that was actually that would not happen because the design itself came from the Titan rocket, which basically propelled Apollo into space. So it has a proven track record. And they assigned certain risks to these problems they had with the joints, and they figured, oh, well, it could happen, but we're fairly certain that we know what causes it and we can fix it. So they continued fixing these small problems, and they thought they actually did, because when they put a fix in place with the following shuttle launch, the problem would usually go away and not occur anymore. But on that particular day, as you can see here, it was very, very cold. It was actually below 0 degrees Celsius. Unfortunately, I don't know how many Fahrenheit that is, but it was very, very cold. It was enough for ice to form on the launch platform. And on that night, the engineers actually said, we would not recommend you to launch, because we cannot actually properly assess the risk of this freezing cold affecting the launch. NASA management still, there was an interesting discussion going on the night before the launch, but in the end, the launch still went ahead. And if you look at this picture, you actually see smoke coming out of one of the solid booster rockets. This is 0.2 seconds or 0.5 seconds into the launch. It's down here. You can see smoke coming out there fairly easy. And what happened was the rings were frozen. They could not fall into the gap as the gap formed. And hot gases immediately passed by the rings, evaporating them on the spot. So there was actually no protection anymore for this particular joint. What happened was that just accidentally, the aluminum oxide, which came out of the combustion chamber, just so happened to fill that gap again. So after 1 second, basically that smoke went away. And engineers just, put yourself in that kind of shoe, just looking at the NASA launch and saying, holy crap, there's smoke coming out of my rocket, which should not be happening. And the problem was that another thing came together on that day, which very rarely happens. A wind shear, basically a very strong wind force, impacted the solid booster rocket. The place where the aluminum oxide just so happened to fill the gap again, that was barely protecting the shuttle from catastrophe. If that wind shear actually would not have hit the space shuttle, Challenger would probably have made it into space. But it just so happened, and 53 seconds into the launch, there's a clear plume coming out of that rocket, and a few seconds later, the solid booster rocket would disconnect at that particular where it's attached to the tank, crash into the tank, and terrible things would happen. We all know what happened next. And this is utterly fascinating. For me, it was very, very fascinating to find out that these risks were actually known, but over time, the perception of them changed. Initially, they found out that these risks exist, but they figured we can fix these problems, and we now assume them, if they occur again, we know what causes them, and we just assume they're normal parts of operations. Diane Vaughan called this the normalization of deviance. What initially was a deviance of what the design expectation was, eventually turned into something that was assumed to be the part of normal operations. And that may start to sound very familiar to you, and I'm going to get to that in a minute. I'm actually going to throw out a couple of book recommendations, and this is one of them. The Challenger launch actually is a very, very complex thing of events coming together. While it seems like a technical thing on the surface, it is actually a very cultural issue, which goes back to the Apollo program, which goes back to how NASA evolved from the Apollo program into what was supposed to be commercial spaceflight. I would definitely recommend reading this 600-page Turner. It is very long, but there's a lot to learn when it comes to cultural issues in companies and teams in large organizations who used to be engineering focused and somehow drifted into something that was supposed to be market focused, that was supposed to be product focused, that was exposed to commercial pressure, to market pressure. And coming back to the normalization of deviance. I'm not sure if someone has seen something like this. This is a picture of our error tracker, and you're probably going to see it better on this one. If you look at one error that has 3.5 thousand occurrences over time, does anyone have had something similar like that? An error that was just ignored in production. Everyone is like, oh yeah, it happens. It's part of normal operations. This is horrible. And this error in particular, it doesn't do much harm because we know what that error is, and we know what causes it, and we know it just continues to happen. It's a normalization of deviance. It's like we include this error in our daily operations, and we just like it. We assume that it always happens. And the problem with that is it removes the salience of actual production problems. You know, we just live with them. And it's a pretty terrible thing to do. There's another name for this kind of phenomenon, and which was coined by Sidney Dekker. He calls it the practical drift. You basically, over time, and this is almost ununderstandable for everyone outside of the organization. Over time, you drift from one state, which you assume the stable state. In the case of Challenger, it was thinking that this design works. It was drifting to, well, this design has flaws, but we know what causes them, we know how they occur, and we basically assume that cold weather actually never occurs in Florida. It was a strange combination of things coming together in that particular case. And that term is actually from this book, which I can also recommend, The Field Guide to Understanding Human Error. Challenger is utterly fascinating because basically, as you know, with the benefit of hindsight, you can always see, oh my God, I saw this coming. How could they not have seen that this particular problem would eventually lead to catastrophe? It's usually what's called hindsight bias, and it's usually what hurts us the most when we look into incidents, when we look into production incidents and outages. And there's an interesting alternative view. What about the things that you actually don't even assume that happen? A very smart person coined the term unknown unknowns. It was this guy. No, it was actually this guy, but there's a certain similarity. But Rumsfeld, well, if you remember what he said in front of a UN commission, it was quite hysterical when you looked at it. He basically talked about things we do not know, we don't know. And like until a few months ago, I was like, holy crap, what did he mean with that? It's like, how can you even come up with something like that? But the more I thought about, in particular, well, physical hardware, where all the strangest things can happen to physical hardware, to all things physical, like in the Challenger. Suddenly it started to make a lot of sense. There are unknown unknowns. There are things that we don't even consider that could happen in production because we've never heard of them. No one has ever experienced any of them. In the case of Challenger, no one has done a commercial space flight like that before. And when Rumsfeld talks about things we do not know, we don't know, I prefer to think of them as risks we do not know, we don't know. Because we cannot, if there's a risk we don't know about, we cannot assign any perceptual value to it. We cannot say, like, this thing has a very small chance of happening. And there's another book about that called The Black Swan, and this Nassim Taleb basically calls these events the Black Swan, because initially, mankind, they only knew white swans. No one actually considered that a black swan could actually exist, because how would they? They've only seen white swans. How would you ever assume that black swans actually exist? You wouldn't even think about it. You would just like, all swans are white. You would not even consider that something like a black swan could exist. And one example I find very, very fascinating of that happened in 2007. And that happened somewhere in Dallas, Texas, where a truck he drove past the stop sign, and this is an actual truck driving past the stop sign, is what the website actually told me, though it's not the truck. In the truck's cabin was a driver that had very low blood pressure, and I don't know the full incident, but I can only assume he fainted and basically lost consciousness. He He drove by the stop sign, he crossed the parking lot, and he crashed into a transformer. And that transformer just so happened to power a data center. There's a lot of data centers in Dallas, Texas, and this was a very peculiar one. And he crashed into it. In the data center, all the normal procedures happened. The power generators came on, and just shortly after that, basically the power switched over to the secondary power source. And as part of the normal operations, the cooling system is reset, and the cooling system has to reboot. And that cycle takes 30 minutes in total. And that time is basically what is needed, is the bare maximum that the service can survive without any cooling. After that, they have a pretty high risk of overheating. And in this particular case, 50 minutes into the reboot cycle, the emergency system who took care of the truck driver, they shut off the secondary power. So now you have a data center that is out of power, and the generators started kicking in again, and the cooling system started another cycle. 15 minutes into that cycle, the time was running out for the service to actually work, for the service to not crash, for the service to, eventually the hardware to be destroyed, melted, but affected by the heat. And so they had to start shutting down the servers. And that is just utterly fascinating. How would you ever assume that a truck driver would crash into your primary data power source, and that a rescue team would eventually cut off your secondary data source? Because redundancy is usually what we rely on, to reduce the impact of any risks we know and risks we actually don't know. And in this case, no one ever thought about this particular thing that it could happen. It is just a crazy incident coming together. And if you look at it, there's not one incident coming together, it's a lot of single causes coming together to form a catastrophe. And reading through the backlog of this is very fascinating. It's unfortunately hard to find on the internet, but it is a very peculiar accident, and there's not a lot. I don't know of any occurrence of something similar happening after that. It is just very, very curious. But what they relied on in the data center was redundancy, and it's usually what we rely on. We rely on redundancy when it comes to our databases. When it comes to our application servers, we always have a backup around so we can switch over when the time comes. And to reduce the impact of these risks, what they did is they added redundancy. If you want to reduce the impact of your secondary power source to go down, what do? You add a third power source, you add a fourth power source, which is what in this case happened. So the problem with that is it still doesn't reduce the risk. It still doesn't reduce the risk of all of your power sources actually going away. So if you shift your mind to treating these incidents in a different way, you actually need to optimize for mean time to recovery. This is actually going to be your biggest asset. How can you, when an event that you have no idea that it could happen, when that happens, the question is how quickly can you respond to it? How quickly can you go into an emergent situation and handle the problem? And sometimes the answer is redundancy. Sometimes the answer is we don't know, because you don't know the risk. You don't know the impact of the risk. You don't know the impact of the event when it actually occurs. There are extreme risks that you can only venture a guess. You can only venture a guess that if a truck driver could run into my data center's power source, could a space shuttle crash into my power source, could an airplane crash into my power source. There's a ton of situations that could happen. The question is, which one do you assign a certain risk to? Which one do you deem worthy actually assessing, or which one are just outside of your control? But even for these situations, you need to think about, what do you do when something actually happens that I have no control about? Companies like Opscode and Etsy have popularized something called the game day as a certain, to develop certain response scenarios for this, which is very fascinating because it comes from fire departments and other high resilience organizations. They basically practice responding to events, responding to dangerous and emergent scenarios. And what you come out with is an assessment of acceptable risk. Things you can live with, and things you know about, and actually trying to assess what an impact of this risk of this event would actually cause you, what kind of trouble it would cause. Because in your normal operations, this is basically you. You're working in boundaries. You're working in boundaries of what your workload is, basically the time you can actually spend without fainting or falling asleep on your desk. You have money constraints, and you have safety constraints. And basically, in your normal day operations, you usually move inside these boundaries. Sometimes you cross one of them, because the only way to actually figure out where these boundaries are is to cross them. And the unfortunate part about the safety boundary is that when you cross it, accidents happen. Stuff goes down in production. The unfortunate reality of our daily work is in web operations that to actually figure out how our systems break, we need to break that. We need to run across that boundary. And most of us have the fortunate benefit of, if things go down, what we get is unhappy customers, but we do not harm any lives. And I personally appreciate that a lot every day. That when something goes down, I will have angry customers, and understandably so. But at least I can continue to cross this boundary, or to figure out where I'm going, and how I can maneuver safely without actually bringing my site down. And Facebook has a very, very interesting perspective on that. It's called move fast and break things. And this is a luxury we have in web operations and web development. We can ship new stuff very quickly. We can see if it breaks production. If it does, we can take it down again. I don't know if anyone read the Knight Capital report filing with the SEC that just came out 2 days ago. It's a very fascinating example for this. But there are other industries who basically do all but move fast. They move very, very slowly, but they still break things. And this is one of my favorite pictures ever. If you look over here, it's basically a Boeing trapped in an apparatus that basically pulls up the wings. It takes the wings, pulls them up, and what it does is it wants to find out the place where the wings actually break off. And there's a video basically showing this. And when it actually finally does break off, the engineers cheer. They're very, very happy because they predicted when it would break. And in this particular scenario, they bend the wings some 50% over what is assumed to be the normal, the normal realm of things happening when planes are actually in the air. You will very rarely see a plane having the wings bend up this high when it's actually flying in the sky. But they still try to push it way beyond that to have a certain buffer, to have a margin of error that when it actually does happen, they at least have this a little bit of a safety that it can still bend before it actually breaks off in the air, because that would make for a very unfortunate incident. So what these guys are doing is they verify the extreme risks. They verify things that they can only assume that would happen, but they still want to be ready for it. And there's one interesting tool in the world of web operations called Chaos Monkey. And the fun question is, has anyone ever just on purpose shut off a production server? Sweet. You also get a high five. It's pretty awesome. That's the part where you explicitly cross the boundary of safety. You shut off a production server, and you actually maybe you do know what happens, maybe you don't. But it will at least give you an idea of where that boundary is. Which server can you safely shut down? Which server needs more redundancy? Or do you need to change your normal operations procedures to handle this kind of incident? Because servers go down all the time, and some servers are easy to replace, others are not that easy to replace. It gives you a very nice picture. It allows you basically to verify your assumptions of how systems run in production, or how your application responds to problems in production, because unfortunately, problems will happen in production. One last thing I want to look at is company culture. Because when you look at failure, the question is, do you accept that they happen, or do you just sweep them under a rug? There are companies, the bigger they get, the more they tend to sweep them under a rug. And there's a fascinating example of Alcoa, which is a big aluminum producer in the United States. In the 1980s, they got on a new CEO, Paul O'Neill, who would then become the Secretary of the Treasury in the United States. And when he came on, he basically said, I'm going to make safety in the factories my #1 priority. I'm going for the 0 injuries. Alcoa actually had a fairly low impact of accidents in the normal daily operations, but they still had them. And Paul O'Neill looked for something that allowed him to transform the company into something that would focus on production. It was focused on shipping great products to the customer. And he took failures as one of his cues. He basically shifted the culture from not really doing anything about accidents. He instituted rules that would his entire management team would have to report any accidents within 24 hours of them happening. And they not only had to report the accident, they had to report what are they going to do about them to make sure they never happen again, or that their impact is reduced in the future. And for that to happen, the entire company had to form a very, very different picture of communication. Alcoa was one of the first companies to actually have company internal email in the 80s, which gave them a competitive advantage, which their competitors were like, how are they doing this? And what O'Neill basically instated was a set of rules which also affected the people on the production floor, the people at the sharp end of where the action is, the people that are actually affected directly by the accidents, because, well, terrible things happen when you, maybe I don't want to talk about it. Terrible things happen on an aluminum production floor. He instated a lot of these rules, and on the way, he managed to transform the entire company into something that was not only focused on safety and reducing the impact of these failures, but also something that, in turn, focused on increasing production volume. Because somehow, in his reign, in 13 years, he retired in 2000, he managed to take the revenue of the company from $3 billion up to $27 billion. And somehow along the way, he's managed to create what we now call DevOps. Pretty crazy when you think about it, because like it's an aluminum factory. It's in a factory. It's a company where like up to 20,000 people work, and they all work together for a common goal. And that common goal is to learn from failures. And the weird part about that is I got all that example from a book which is called The Power of Habit, because O'Neill basically took one habit and changed it in a way that what he thought would affect the production part. He accepted the idea that failures would happen, but he had very strict rules about making sure that the right things are learned from these failures. And why are all these things really important? Why is it fascinating to look at other industries? For me, it turns into production outages will happen. They will happen all the time. Things will go down. The question is, how can you respond to them? And there's an interesting word for that, and it's called resilience. Resilience is basically the idea when something impacts your production system, you have your team, your production system itself is very flexible. It doesn't immediately crash everything. You can find ways to make it bend. Instead of your entire system going down when a production failure happens, you can find ways to reduce the impact. And whenever something happens, your entire team, your entire organization has ways to easily bounce back from these failures. And that is very, very fascinating. And as a web operations, we're still a very young field. Very young field in as web development as well. And it turns out that a lot of other industries have already put a lot of time into figuring out how you can handle these engineering problems, how you can handle production outages, or even how you can handle problems that could affect human lives, which most of us have the luxury of not happening, except for when you write software for a nuclear power plant, which I really wish you do not. It's probably not a great responsibility to have. And what I wish for is that we as a web operations industry, or as a culture, would not only consider looking at these other industries, but just instead of just letting failure pass and not talk about it, was what I wish for is that we actually talk about it, because there's a lot to learn. The failure itself is not something you can avoid, but you can always make sure that you can take something away from it. Thank you.